Welcome back. That was a very short break. The upcoming keynote I've truly been looking forward to. You will hear from a true mover and shaker in Silicon Valley. They do still exist. He knows pretty much everyone in the Valley, and I've had the pleasure of working with him in San Francisco several times. Always learned a lot from him. We led some delegations across the city into VC offices in the Valley, crammed ourselves into one-room startup offices, and almost got ourselves stuck in an office building basement with a bunch of bank managers at one point. So we have an interesting past. Nowadays, we can't really explore Silicon Valley in person if we're not living there. So we're experiencing exactly what this keynote is actually about, diffusion. I kind of miss those $12 avocado toasts though. I'm very happy to welcome the founder of 650 Labs, business strategist and board advisor, management researcher, author, keynote speaker, and investor, Mark. Welcome. We can't hear you.
Good afternoon, everyone from Europe.
Hi.
Good morning if you're dialing in from the US today.
I will leave the stage over to you, Mark. You take it away when you want to.
Okay, this may be a talk versus a presentation. Unfortunately, I just slight technical difficulties, but no matter. The half a dozen slides probably were useless anyway. So welcome, everyone. I want to talk about a concept today. We are now 6+ months into COVID and heading into month 7. And I want to have a conversation around what's happening with what I call the diffusion of everything. I'm talking to you today. You're probably sitting at home. 99% of you are sitting at home. Maybe a few of you are beginning to go back into the office. But over the last 6 months, I've been talking to executives throughout the world on what they see happening in a long term in terms of COVID and its impact on cities, its impact on technology clusters, its impact on Silicon Valley, its impact on multinationals, on fintechs, on unicorns. And what this research I've been doing over the last 6 months, I call it the diffusion of everything. So let's start with this idea that urban areas and the clustering effect of businesses was kind of a way to consolidate power and to have efficient use of resources, right? We became urbanized centuries ago because it was just more efficient. Trade was more efficient. We could provide. There's somebody found my slides. Thank you. And I might say next when we go on to the next. So historically we were clustered around these urban areas, and it provided a lot of efficiency in terms of assets and power and resources. Next. And what we're now seeing is an acceleration of a so-called diffusion, and I believe that what I said earlier, all of the above, is going to be radically reconfigured. Next, and I want to I'll make some comments later about remote work from home and hybrid, but I do believe they're all the future. And there's some limitations which we'll talk to later in the session in the Q&A. Next. And the big question is, if this is the new normal, what does it mean for employees? What does it mean for businesses? And what does it mean for society? And I've got 7 or 8 questions at the end we can hopefully engage in. Next. So here's some headlines. By the way, I've diffused. As Sarah was saying, we have a long working history in the past, and she knew me when I was a resident of downtown San Francisco, but I'm talking to you today from the mountains of Colorado because I personally have diffused temporarily. But if you look at some headlines, and there's many more like this, Google says to its employees, come back late summer 2021. Uber says, come back late summer 2021. Facebook as well, late summer 2021. In fact, early autumn. Over a year from now, they're saying, come back to the office. Then we look at traditional companies. We saw Siemens make an announcement that they're going, quote, remote with nearly 400,000 staff. And what does that look like? And then Twitter, and we're seeing this elsewhere, Twitter is just saying, we've closed our corporate headquarters in San Francisco and we're not coming back. And so this whole conversation is kind of a big picture conversation, mind you. But one of my assertions around this whole movement is this a tipping point? Do we see enough companies, and certainly in the tech sector, but do we see enough companies adopt either long-term remote or long-term hybrid work strategies that every other tech company has to do it because it just becomes a standard benefit? In other words, will there be a tipping point to say, well, look, if Google and Facebook and Uber and others are going permanent with a work from home, hybrid, or remote type work atmosphere, every tech company has to do it, because otherwise you're not going to attract the best people. I'll go work for Google because they have a more flexible work environment. And then take that further, if it happens in the tech sector, are we going to see traditional companies mimic that? Traditional companies at times try to mimic these tech companies in terms of their culture and leadership and work practices. Is this something they're going to try to mimic as well? So that's where I'm keeping my eyes in the next year, and certainly in the next 25 minutes. Let's have that debate amongst the participants today. Next. And so, if you step back and think about it, there's a lot of things driving it. People remain largely, I say some, but they remain largely, very cautious about their own health. People are during the last 6 months, they're kind of reevaluating their career and life priorities and what's important to them. And it may not be, physically living close to a demanding job. Thirdly, people are, using this as an opportunity to kind of optimize their financial life and make some financial choices and priorities. And some people, this fourth one is a mixed bag. Some people are saying they're thoroughly enjoying this work from home model, this hybrid model, a remote model. And I'm going to give a definition here shortly. Others are saying, gee, we're social animals and I miss being around people, and I'm not sure this can, sustain itself. There was recent Towers Perrin research in the UK that 1/3 of people surveyed in a UK panel, in a UK audience, said they were, having some mental difficulties with this work from home and remote work environment. And then I think many companies that I've talked to in the last 6 months throughout the world are, radically rethinking their office. And that's being forced on them by COVID, but they're saying, hey, longer term, well, how does this look? How does this play out? A well-known multinational in London, they're headquartered in the US, but they have a large London office near Finsbury Square. They were recently told, you can come back to the office we lease you, the property manager told them this, but we require a 50% reduction in the workforce. You have a set half an hour in the morning and a set half an hour in the evening to come into the building and depart the building. I think it was like 8:30 to 9 and then 5:30 to 6. Those are the only half-hour slots you have to come in the building and exit the building. You cannot leave during the day, and there's no visitors. And this multinational saying, what's the point of having an office if this policy could continue for a year or more? Next. So let's start with the diffusion of cities. That old slogan about America, the land of the free. The latest moniker for San Francisco and New York in particular are the land of the flee. Everyone's fleeing, everyone's taking off. The so-called exodus, we're seeing vacancy rates in residential properties, both in Manhattan and in San Francisco, approaching 40% in some buildings. People are leaving. And the question is, do they come back? the 6+ months have taken a tremendous toll on the retail sector, on restaurants and bars, and the social fabric. Can we go to events? Can we go to cinema? Can we go to the opera? And so all of the let's say social attractions of a city, it remains unclear when and how those things are going to operate again, and do people leave and not come back? And I think you can also look at this kind of on an age basis. Certainly, if I were to look carefully at Silicon Valley, the 20-somethings just don't have the financial resources to stick around in that environment. So they've fled. They've largely gone home. They're now dispersed throughout the U.S. They're trying to get jobs in the local market in which they originally came from. And then the 30s and 40s, the 30 to 40-year-olds or 30 to 45-year-olds are saying, is it time to go live in a less expensive locale? And we're seeing people already begin to make those moves, and then companies making, frankly, from Silicon Valley downward salary adjustments to compensate that. So watch for this diffusion of cities. Next. And the corollary to that is the diffusion of talent. The talent is going to spread out. There was again, using this metaphor of my backyard of Silicon Valley. Historically, there was this giant concentration of talent, and we had talent from all over the world. There's certainly a Danish contingent in the valley, and a Dutch contingent, a UK contingent, a German, and Swiss, and Spanish, and Indian, and Chinese. Our view is that talent is going to diffuse back around the world. It's not going to be so concentrated to the point above in the cities. Next. And then the corollary to the diffusion of talent is the diffusion of teams. We may not, our view is we may not end up being remote forever, but we may disperse, even in a large metropolitan area, we may disperse. Instead of one big office, we may have 4 or 5, smaller offices to serve a very large urban area. But certainly we're seeing, teams disperse away from that headquarter environment. Next. We're going to see a diffusion of multinationals. I think Siemens in Munich is a start with nearly 400 people. They said, and there may be a slightly different version of this presentation floating around, but I want to put a finer point on remote versus hybrid. And I want to use that in the context of Siemens, because it was a pretty big announcement, them saying they're going to, quote, go remote. In fact, if you read the fine print, what they're talking about is going hybrid. A hybrid says you still live in the metropolitan area. You do not go to your desk 5 days a week, but you may go to your office 1 to 2 days a week. So you go into your office to coordinate with other people, and then the other days is more of a work from home. That's a hybrid model. You're still going to have to live in the metropolitan area. You might live a little further out. You might diffuse in that metropolitan area or to a more suburban setting versus in the core, because your commute times could be longer, but you're not doing it as frequently, right? You may only be going to the office twice a week. That's hybrid, and you're still required or it's necessary to live in the metropolitan area. Remote says you can live hundreds of kilometers away from the head office. You can live in another country, and you may only go into that office 2 times let's say once a quarter, or at a maximum twice a quarter for a couple of days. So I want to parse out hybrid versus remote, because I think when we talk about these scenarios, we kind of lump these terms together. So I draw a real distinction. I see multinationals going more towards a hybrid model, not necessarily a fully remote model. So that's the comments around multinationals. Next. Certainly the diffusion of Silicon Valley. I historically have been very long on Silicon Valley. It was a network effect. It was a clustering of talent and venture capital and startups and scale-ups and tech multinationals. It was the only tech cluster in the world that had launched a Google and a Facebook and an Uber and an Airbnb and a Tesla and that had been going on for about 80 years. But if you fast forward this thesis around diffusion, and I mentioned all the companies that are coming up with true remote policies, work where you want and we'll figure it out kind of approach. I think that's going to accelerate, very well could accelerate the demise of Silicon Valley to the advantage of other parts of the world. So, there's 100 plus tech clusters around the world, and certainly Copenhagen is one of them. In fact, there's a Wikipedia entry called technology centers, and most of them start with silicon, but there's other flavors. But there's Silicon Wadi in Israel, there's Silicon Glen up in Scotland, there's Silicon Beach down in LA, right? There used to be there is Silicon Alley in New York, Silicon Roundabout in London. I think it's to all of those other tech clusters to their advantage, and in fact to Silicon Valley's long-term disadvantage. I believe you're going to see an acceleration of it's going to be less relevant going forward. I believe it is the scenario that I'm positing in September of 2020. Next, so if the Valley diffuses, venture capital diffuse. And again, if I look at Sand Hill Road and I look at the patterns of investing, it in the last decade has gotten more comfortable investing outside of the Valley. It started making smaller bets in markets around the world. I think Dave McClure at 500 Startups kind of started this trend. He was spreading around a lot of money in very very unique places around the world, and he was putting money into Africa but sitting in Silicon Valley. And I think, in other words, I don't believe that startups are going to come to Sand Hill Road and line up and pitch, and then the venture firm says, "Well, if you relocate here, I'll invest in you." That was the old pattern, and I think the new pattern is that VCs, not only in Silicon Valley but around the world, are going to have to go find the deal flow, and it's not going to be coming to them and in their backyard, and it's not going to be naturally around a cluster. Next, the diffusion of unicorns. Historically, about 40% of all unicorns have been in Silicon Valley. We've seen a slow progression where they're popping up in Europe, they're popping up in China. I think that trend is going to continue. It's going to accelerate the diffusion of unicorns, and Silicon Valley is not going to have a lock on that going forward. Next, capital will also diffuse as I mentioned with venture capital. Capitalism in general is going to diffuse, and it's going to be, I think, easier to access capital anywhere else in the world. It's not going to be tied to physical locations. Next, and then fintechs. We have, 30 plus known fintech ecosystems around the world. Those will further diffuse, and I think as we go through that process, that fintechs are going to pop up everywhere, and they're going to be much easier to access versus the physicality of having to go to a face-to-face meeting on another continent to figure out whether it's relevant or not. And then next, and then the diffusion of banking. What does the future of banking look like? I've seen recent reports. We know retail banking has had a tough time over the last decade, and how to respond to general disruptive changes. And this environment we've been in the last 6 months is going to further reshape banking. Our relationship with our local bank, and in a branch network type of environment with a mobile app and local services, is going to give way to, conditioned upon regulatory frameworks. It's going to provide a diffusion of banking, and we're going to see additional competitors come into the market and shake things up for traditional banks. Next. So I just want to put all these out there. We have less than 10 minutes, but questions that I'm thinking about on remote, hybrid, and work from home. I'd start with, how do we identify, attract, hire, coach, and motivate employees in an environment that's remote? Are we going to hire high caliber professionals in a environment where we don't get to meet with them, we don't get to see them? I've been on both sides of that. I've done some hiring in the last 6 months, and I've seen others struggle with this idea that how can I hire this person if I can't physically see them or meet with them? But if you look down the value chain of somebody, you have to identify, attract, hire, coach, motivate. What does that look like? You don't get the FaceTime with the boss anymore to grab a beer or a chat after work. You don't get to position for that special project. You don't get what I call the serendipitous moments. You don't get the time together. It's just very random in this remote or hybrid kind of environment. Next. And then what impact does this have on employee mobility and turnover? So if we go remote and people get distributed and dispersed, their employment prospects could be potentially harder to come by if they're not in a clustering model like a Silicon Valley or like a Copenhagen. If those urban areas become less important over time, then what does that mean for job mobility for people? So this is something we're going to be paying very close attention to in the coming couple of years. Next. And then how do we adjust to this new cadence of work? Like everyone on this call today, I suspect you might have 30, 40, maybe even 50 Zoom calls or team calls or Blue Jeans, whatever. Pick your flavor of web technology, video technology. But how do we adapt to this new cadence of work where there seems to be little downtime between meetings? We seem to be in many ways overbooked, overscheduled. It seems we're much more task oriented in this remote environment and less strategically inclined. We don't have white spaces around the day to do things. And I think people are still struggling and grappling with finding that right work cadence. And I refer to that Towers Perrin research earlier to say that people are feeling mentally stressed along these lines, and I think it relates to this third point. Next, and then what happens to high performance company culture? There's shelf feet of books written about Silicon Valley, written about its culture, its leadership style. Shelf feet of books written about Google and other companies. And I'm not a complete fanboy. These companies have their downsides. I'd argue that these companies organizationally are in constant experimentation, and with constant experimentation, you're bound to make some mistakes. So I think what they do, 80% is pretty good organizationally, and I think 20% of what they do is caustic and volatile and extremely wrong. And let's hope they try to learn from that 20% and make less, organizational mistakes. But I do believe largely that they have designed, high performance cultures. Now, if Google stays remote, like they've announced they will for the next year or more, and if Facebook does the same and Uber does the same, and it becomes a bigger trend, this number 4, this is a very, very real question. Can they hold together the high performance company cultures that made them successful in the first place? So this is going to be a real aha. So watch this space carefully. Next. And And then what does it mean related to 4? What does it mean for organizational performance and effectiveness? Can they keep that flywheel spinning to the extent they have in the last decade or two? 6, next. And then what happens to our city centers and large office parks? Prior to temporarily relocating to Colorado a few weeks ago, I was actually still going into a downtown San Francisco WeWork location. They're on 535 Mission, if you know the space, and I had the complete floor to myself. WeWork decided not to close the office because then it'd be difficult to collect rents, so they thought they'd just leave it open. Nobody was coming in, but you walk around downtown, and it reminds you of that new Rolling Stones video, "Living in a Ghost Town," completely empty, and all these large organizations are saying, we're not going to come back. And then lastly, what is it going to look like when we start adjusting wages down for people that begin to work remote for a long time? One data point, very well-known Silicon Valley company. I know a VP there. He decides to move to Chicago in the last month, and they took a 10% pay cut. Another well-known company, Silicon Valley company, says if you move from Palo Alto to Denver, of all places, coincidentally Denver, you're going to get an 18% pay cut. And I think this is going to be unpopular, but at the same time, I think if you look at the mathematics of it and people's own personal objectives, they may decide it's worth it. So these are just kind of a set of questions that we're starting to think about. I want to turn this back over to Sarah.
Yeah.
And see if there's any other questions from the audience.
We do have a question from the audience. Tobias is asking, I can imagine governments would want to actually stop diffusion, as it could mean a company hires its staff from a cheaper location, thus removing a tax income for them. How do you see that?
I think that's an excellent question, Tobias. Thank you. I don't think you can stop globalization. We have the internet. The internet works. I can today go hire somebody in Greece or Belarus or India or Brazil. That's been done. I suspect governments may try to corral this problem, but I think it's going to be exceedingly difficult to stop. One response I would have to that is you just look at the global tax system, and it's not really harmonized, and so therefore companies around the world exploit low tax jurisdictions, right?
Yeah.
This is the knock on Starbucks not paying tax in the UK or Google not paying tax in Europe, right? Yeah. They have just structured their double Dutch Irish entity to avoid tax. So it's an excellent question, but it's one I think governments are going to be on the losing side of. They're not going to be able to react efficiently, just like they've not been able to react to global tax harmonization to date.
Thank you. Mark, we are up. Time is up, but thank you so much. I love to listen to this, and I think you're absolutely right. I'm going to follow Diffusion closely, and I hope to see you in Silicon Valley at some point. And stay safe in Colorado.
Yeah, and thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the sessions I've been able to listen in on, and we'll listen into some more. Thanks all, and have a good evening in Europe.
Thank you.